Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving into uh, a scenario that has a lot of you kind of nervous. I think what happens to Washington, D.C. A whole lot of question marks hanging over D.C.'s future.
Yeah, it is fascinating, though, isn't it? This whole dynamic between DC's local government and the federal government. I mean, most cities don't have to deal with that. But it does leave DC vulnerable, and that's especially true with a president like Trump, given their history.
Right. Let's rewind a bit and talk about that history. I think we all remember those not-so-subtle digs Trump took at D.C., calling it crime-ridden, and even going so far as to threaten a federal takeover back in 2020. I'm sure that sent shivers down a few spines.
Definitely. That kind of talk, it raises some serious questions about how a second Trump administration might treat DC. This isn't just about, policy disagreements. It goes deeper. It really gets into the whole idea of local control, whether the people of DC have the right to govern themselves.
And that's where things get really interesting for you, listener, because D.C. isn't a state. It's wide open to interference from Congress. And if the Republicans get control of the House, that power dynamic could shift in a big way.
You got it. Think about it. Congress has the final say on DC's budget and its laws. Imagine that. Your city council makes decisions, and then a bunch of lawmakers who don't even live there get to scrutinize them and maybe even overturn them. That's what DC is up against.
Some of your sources even brought up the possibility of repealing the D.C. Home Rule Act. Now, just a quick reminder for anyone who isn't up on their political jargon, this act was passed back in 1973. It gave D.C. residents a level of self-governance they didn't have before. They could finally elect their own mayor and city council.
Taking that away would be devastating for DC's autonomy. It would basically be saying, you don't have the right to decide what happens in your own city.
That's a real power grab. But even if they don't repeal home rule, Congress can still get involved. Remember those riders that get tacked on to bills? So, listener, just a quick explanation. A rider is basically a sneaky little addition to a bill that might have nothing to do with what the bill is actually about.
Yeah.
They're a way to push through policies that wouldn't pass on their own.
Exactly.
No.
Like that attempt to stop DC from using speed cameras, if that rider had gone through, it would cost the city $1 billion in revenue. That's a massive blow. And it shows how Congress can basically use its power over the budget to control DC.
This feels like a classic David and Goliath situation, D.C., going up against the whole federal government.
Good analogy. But just like in those underdog stories, there's always hope. Your sources actually highlight some amazing efforts by local leaders and activists who are ready to fight for DC's autonomy. They're building coalitions, lobbying Congress, and reminding everyone that the people of DC deserve a voice.
Sounds like we're about to see a real tug of war. On one side, you've got the potential for more federal control under a second Trump term. On the other side, you've got this fierce determination
It
from
often
people.
ends up setting a precedent for other cities and states, too. It's a test case for how much power the federal government can have over what happens locally.
So let's say Trump really does double down on this cleaning up D.C. idea. What could that actually look like for the people who live there?
Well, for starters, you could see a lot more scrutiny of local laws. Maybe budgetary restrictions that make it tougher for the city to provide basic services. You could even see them rolling back some of those progressive policies that people in D.C. fought so hard for.
One source mentioned the possibility of Trump firing civil servants and dismantling the Department of Education. Wow. That would be a huge upheaval for D.C., especially with so many residents working for the federal government.
Absolutely. This isn't just some political game. This is about real people's lives. The decisions that get made at the top, they directly impact the everyday lives of people in D.C. What they eat, where their kids go to school, even their access to health care. All of that could be on the table.
It sounds like D.C. is facing a real uphill battle here.
No doubt about it. DC's leaders are gonna have to be smart. They'll need to pick their battles carefully, build coalitions to fight back against federal overreach. It's a balancing act. They need to find ways to work with the Trump administration, but also stand their ground when it comes to local control.
Yeah, it's a tightrope walk. But one thing that does give me hope is the resilience of people in D.C. They've faced tough times before, and they've always come out the other side even stronger.
Absolutely, right? Your sources point to all the amazing work being done by activists and community groups. They're already mobilizing, organizing protests, lobbying Congress. They're determined to make their voices heard and make sure D.C. isn't ignored.
One article mentioned this Defend D.C. coalition. Can you fill us in on that?
Sure. So this coalition, it brings together all these different groups and individuals who are committed to protecting DC's home rule and fighting any attempt to weaken the city's autonomy. They're really focused on raising awareness, getting people out to vote, and putting pressure on elected officials.
So the multi-pronged approach.
Exactly. They're working on legal challenges, legislative advocacy, grassroots organizing. They get it. This fight needs a sustained and coordinated effort.
One of your sources mentioned that local artists and musicians are getting involved too, using their platforms to spread the word and encourage people to take action.
That's right. And it's not just about making art that reflects what's going on politically. They're organizing benefit concerts, using their music to bring people together and raise money for organizations that are fighting for DC's rights.
It's really amazing to see how this whole situation is bringing out the creativity and resilience of people in DC. They're not just sitting back and taking it. They're finding all these ways to fight back.
Exactly. They're taking their frustration and anxiety and turning it into action, into art, into a real movement for change. And that's what gives me hope for DC. It's that spirit, that determination to fight for what they believe in.
It's like they're saying, we might be small, but we're not backing down.
Exactly. And they're reminding everyone that DC is more than just some political chessboard. It's a community full of passionate people who really care about their city.
So what does all of this mean for you, listener? Well, it means the future of DC is uncertain, but there's hope too. It means that what people do, the activists, the artists, everyday citizens, it can make a difference.
It also means we all have a role to play, even if we don't live in DC. We can educate ourselves about the issues, support those organizations that are fighting for DC statehood, and let our elected officials know what we think.
And who knows, maybe all of this will actually lead to a better, more just future for DC, a future where the people who live there finally have the rights and the representation they deserve.
That's the hope. And it's definitely a hope worth fighting for.
Okay, so we've talked about the challenges DC might be facing under a second Trump term, but your sources, they also kind of hint at some, some silver linings. What are some of the ways people are pushing back, and could this actually lead to, something positive?
It's funny, actually, this pressure from the federal government, it might actually be helping the push for something DC has been fighting for forever, statehood.
Ah, yes, the quest for DC statehood. It's been going on for ages.
It has. And the arguments against it, they've always been so, political, but with this possibility of more federal meddling under Trump, it might actually change some people's minds.
You're saying it could become less about, which party you support and more about what's fair.
Exactly, because right now, 700,000 American citizens in D.C., they don't have a real voice in Congress. They pay federal taxes, but they don't get to vote for anyone in the House or Senate. That's a tough situation, especially if the federal government is trying to call all the shots in your city, too.
So this could actually give the DC statehood movement a boost.
It's definitely a possibility. The more people understand the situation in D.C., both inside and outside the city, the more likely they are to support statehood. It becomes less about politics and more about basic rights.
That's a powerful argument. And speaking of powerful arguments, you mentioned that people in DC are already taking action. What are some of the ways they're making their voices heard?
Well, like we talked about earlier, there's the Defend DC coalition. It's bringing together a whole bunch of different groups and individuals. They're organizing protests, lobbying Congress, and doing these big public awareness campaigns to really shine a light on what's at stake.
So they're covering all the bases.
Exactly. They're working the legal angles, the legislative side, and the grassroots organizing. They know that this fight needs to be on all fronts, and it needs to keep going.
One of your sources even mentioned that local artists and musicians are getting involved too. They're using their platform to, raise awareness and get people fired up.
That's right. And it's not just about making art that, reflects the political climate. They're actually putting on benefit concerts, using their music to bring people together and raise money for those organizations that are on the front lines fighting for DC's rights.
It's really cool to see how this whole situation is bringing out the creativity and resilience of DC's residents. They're not just, sitting back and taking it. They're finding new ways to fight back.
Exactly. They're turning that frustration and anxiety into action, into art, into a real movement. And that's what makes me optimistic about DC's future. It's that spirit, that refusal to give up.
They're like, we might be small, but we're not going down without a fight.
Exactly. And they're reminding everyone that DC is more than just a political battleground. It's a place full of amazing people who care so much about their city.
So listener, what does all of this mean for you? Well, it means that the future of DC, yeah, it's up in the air, but it's not hopeless. It means that what people do, the activists, the artists, the everyday people, it matters.
It also means that we all have a part to play, even if we don't live in DC. We can learn about the issues, support the groups fighting for statehood, and let our elected officials know what we think.
And hey, maybe all of this will actually lead to a better future for DC. A future where the city finally gets the respect and the rights it deserves.
That's what we're hoping for. And it's worth fighting for.
On that note, we'll leave you with this thought. If D.C. does become a state, what kind of impact will that have on other territories and marginalized communities across the country? What would it mean for the future of democracy in America? Something to think about. Until next time, keep diving deep.